please like and comment on the video below. That will allow me to produce better quality videos and more of them in the future. So we're looking here at a chart from Betfair, and when you look at the charts, on the left hand side axis you have price going from small price to large, and when you look at the right hand side you've got volume going from small to large. So if you look, for example, here, you can see a volume spike, and that's coming in at about 3,000 or so pound. But you can see over here we've got a volume spike, and that's coming in at a much larger amount. So you can see that that's coming in somewhere around sort of 8,000 or so pound. We're sort of pitching it somewhere around here. So you can see that's somewhere between 7.5 and 10,000. So we'll say 8.5 or somewhere around there. Now this is a really simple graph because you can see that this has been backed heavily. And if you look at certain aspects, the interesting thing about looking at a Betfair chart is that it's not really accurate or representative, because if we draw a line down the middle here, this line is representing two distinct different time zones. So from on this side you're looking at about 15 minutes or so, and on this side you're probably looking at about 15 hours. So when you look at the Betfair charts, it's important to understand that that is what you're looking at. So this price activity that occurred here occurred over many, many hours, and this price activity that occurred over here was over many, many minutes. But very significant difference between one side of the graph and the other, and it's for that reason that I recommend that you use advanced charts on BetAngel, because advanced charts on BetAngel, if you load a market into Guardian early in the day, it will gather data for you, and you can scroll backwards and look at it in real time, and you get a different view on the graph. So I mean, basically when you look at a Betfair graph, this part here is reasonably sort of heavily distorted, and part of the reason for that is if you look at the volume at the bottom here, can you see we had this volume spike over here, but the rest of the volume is really, really low. So you can pretty much draw a line and you can see how low this volume is, excluding the spike that we saw there. The interesting thing about this spike is if we look at the spike there and then look at the graph above it, you can see it had very little difference, very little impact on the overall price activity in the market. So you can sort of discount that. There's a little bump. If we look really closely, there's a little bump here, and that could be where perhaps somebody put an order in the market, messed up, and then immediately dumped the order back out again. So it's not impossible that that was it. So where you generally see spikes, that's what you're looking for. You're looking to see what impact it actually had on the market itself. But yeah, if you draw a line, if I reference you back to here, if you draw a line at the bottom, you can see that there's very little volume in the market. In the first half of the graph, again, I'll draw the line up the middle for you here. And then as we got closer to the start, you can see there's significant volume. But that's typical. That is exactly what you would expect. There's nothing unusual in this graph in terms of what we're expecting to see, because prior to interest in this market really beginning to develop, you can see that the volume was relatively low. And then, of course, when the market really begins to develop, then the money arrives, and that forms activity within the market. But you will see that if you're sat there watching a market, you will actively see new money arriving within the market. So the thing that tends to interest me most within a market is little spikes that you get. So this spike here we've already examined, and we said that it didn't have a significant amount of impact on price, and therefore we can probably discount that as having any significance whatsoever. That didn't really seem to make any difference at all. However, if we look at these spikes over here, you can actually see that that actually formed pretty much the bottom of the market. You can see if we draw a line across from here and pitch it over here, you can see that the market more or less sort of got down to about this level and then refused to go any lower. So the spikes that we see over on this side are probably an indication that the market has sort of reached a level at which nobody was willing to go any further down. And therefore these spikes, and again, if you're looking at the ladder when you're actively trading, you'll be able to correlate this to any activity that you see, but that was probably signalling an end to the activity within the market. If you look at, I'll highlight some more for you here. So if you look at the activity that we're seeing here, can you see that when this spike occurred in the market, there was a bit of backing going on? You can see the price got pulled down. And because there was fairly consistent backing at various points up until this particular point in the market, then, and if we will highlight one over here as well, but can you see that generally the pattern of activity in this market is there's reasonable amounts of volume. And what's happening when we get that volume? Well, that seems to more or less correspond to a pull down in price. So if we highlight this one here, you can see how the market pulled some activity in here, and again you can see it from there. So very often when you're looking at charts, what you're doing is you're sort of saying, well, what activity am I seeing, and what sort of pressure is that creating in the market? So we saw a volume spike here, we see a couple more here, and you can see that every time that there's a sort of a general burst of activity in this period, then that's necessarily pulling the price in. Now, down here, you can see that there are spikes, but they're much smaller. But that's perfectly natural within the market. As volume arrives in the market, you would expect it to develop a sort of curve that looks something like that. Now, I've drawn this really roughly, but basically what you're saying is that, activity in the market over here, the amount of volume is going to be much higher than it is over here. Because as we get closer and closer to the off, as you will know, or as you would have seen in videos already, then volume naturally builds into the market at that particular point in time. So necessarily, you'd expect a curve, something like that, to develop. So even though we're looking at this activity here and it looks relatively small, it still bears roughly equal significance to what we're seeing over here in terms of price activity. And of course, we're looking at this after the market has happened. But as the market is developing, then of course you won't be able to see activity. So say we joined the market and we're looking at the market in this particular time period over here, somewhere, between the open of the market and to this particular point, then the graph's going to look slightly different at that particular point. So the fact that we're looking at it after it's occurred will distort the way that the market looks. But it's very likely that when you're actively trading, this bump here would look very similar to this bump here. All that's happened is the amount of volume that we're seeing late on in the market over here is just dwarfing the early volume. But that's exactly what you'd expect. Like I said before, the volume curve is going to go something like that when we're actively looking at a market. But there are many different aspects to charts. The Betfair charts are a bit one-dimensional. You really should be using the advanced charting. I'll put a link to the advanced charting mega video at the end of this particular video. And you should have a look at that, because using the BetAngel charting, you'll get a much, much better view on the market. The purpose of this video is just to give you an overview of information that you can see contained within this particular market. And if this video is of interest, leave me a comment and I'll give you some analysis on other charts and what they look like and patterns of behavior that you're likely to see. Because you can pick up on things like a bit of support and resistance, and also if there's a lack of activity, that can be interesting on a particular runner within the market. Anyway, I hope that's been useful for you.